Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch of the special issue Exploring Varieties of Peace in Journal on Peacebuilding and Development. We're really delighted that you're all here. My name is Elisabeth Olivius, and I'm an associate professor at Umeå University in Sweden and founding member of the Varieties of Peace research network. And most importantly today, one of the special issue editors. My co-editor is Malin Åkebo, also from Umeå University and also a founder of the same research network. And it's been a lot of fun for us to work on this issue together and together with all of the amazing authors who contributed to it. And we're really happy and proud to see it published and to discuss it with you here today. We're going to start this event with a brief background to the special issue and an overview of its content. So the main knowledge gap that we set out to address is that paradoxically, while peace is widely held up as a main goal for policy, practice, and research, not least peace research, of course, peace research hasn't really explored and theorized peace itself as much as one might expect. And this is even more true for the broader disciplines of international relations and political science and so on. So the positive-negative peace dichotomy has remained the main conceptual tool for decades. And positive peace is often too broad and too utopian to really be analytically useful. But negative peace, on the other hand, doesn't really tell us anything about the character of peace beyond the absence of armed violence. So what does peace actually look like? How is it experienced? And how does this vary? So our starting point was that we need analytical tools that can systematically describe, compare, and explain how peace varies across contexts and over time. And this was consistent with calls made by a lot of, or at least several prominent scholars over the last few years, that we need new theoretical frameworks, analytical tools, new methodologies to capture and measure peace beyond the absence of war. And we have been trying to work in conversation with and draw on and build on these other ongoing attempts to advance conceptualizations of peace as well. So this is the result of a topic search in Social Science Citation Index that shows that peace is indeed much less common as a research topic than security and conflict. So peace is the green line here. So while there's been an increase over time, that is true for the amount of research generally, and peace is still clearly much less common to focus on by researchers. And obviously this is a rough measure, but it still gives us an idea that peace is rarely at the center of analytical attention. And this is a map from Uppsala conflict data program. So here we can see a lot of variation when it comes to the intensity of conflict, the brown, reddish parts of the map. And many of you would know that Uppsala conflict data program also works with quite sophisticated categories to capture different types of conflict. But the areas where there's no armed conflict are all white. So there's no variation in peace. And we know that this image is not consistent with reality. For example, Sweden and Saudi Arabia, both white on this map, clearly peace in these two countries are not the same. And if we limit our attention to context that has experienced armed conflict in the fairly recent history, the peace in Sri Lanka is evidently also quite different from the peace in South Africa or the peace in Cambodia. And post-war processes of peace building are complex and messy, and the outcomes are diverse and unpredictable. It's not all white. So we need a new kind of map that would add nuance to these white areas. In other words, we need to move beyond the common dichotomies of our field. So while peace has often been discussed in terms of positive or negative peace, and peace processes evaluated in terms of successes or failures, most real-world cases fall between these categories, so somewhere here. So how do we develop approaches that can tell us more about this yellow real-world cases area? beyond and between the dichotomies of positive and negative peace and success and failure. So our response, our attempt to address this situation is organized under the Varieties of Peace Research Network. And this research network started out as a research program at Umeå University in Sweden, but is now a broader network. It has around 60 members, I think, today from around the world. And it's meant as a channel for dialogue and networking amongst researchers interested in this type of research agenda. And it also works as an umbrella for related research projects and initiatives. So we aim to foster a research agenda focused on better understanding, theorizing, and explaining the nature and variation of peace across space and time. And as part of the original research program, we organized a conference in Jakarta in October in 2019, the Varieties of Peace Asia Conference. And that conference became the start of the project that would lead up to this special issue. And I will now leave it to Malin, my co-editor, to give an overview of the special issue itself.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So the special issue seeks to advance both conceptual understandings as well as empirical analysis of peace that provide new insights into the way in which peace is manifested, experienced, and understood. So the contributions analyze peace in a diversity of empirical contexts and also using a diversity of analytical approaches. So in the editorial article, Elisabeth and I outlined the knowledge gap and research agenda and how the special issue contributions expand and deepens our understanding of varieties of peace. And Anders Nordhag in his article challenges conventional assumptions about where and when peace can be observed through an analysis of Rojava in northern Syria. So by engaging with the literature on zones of peace, he argues that dichotomous conceptions of war and peace as mutually exclusive phenomena prevent scholars from exploring the character of peace that sometimes do emerge in the midst of war. And Sang-Yong Lee also shows how the nature of peace can vary within states. So through an analysis of everyday peace in Cambodia and drawing on a relational approach, he finds that the nature of peace varies significantly within and between local communities and is characterized by its often mundane, subtle expressions of peace and shaped by the interplay between local agency and overarching political structures. And through an analysis of the documentary film Demons in Paradise in the context of peace building in Sri Lanka, Nilanjana Premaratna shows how documentary film can offer useful pathways through which we can understand, elicit, and inform plural visions of peace in post-war contexts. And she will also present her study here later on during this event. Special issue articles also contribute to explaining the character of peace. So Miri Söderberg Kovacs, Christine Höglund, and Melida Jimenez show how autonomy settlements shape the emerging peace through an analysis of peace in Mindanao in the Philippines, using the peace triangle as a conceptual tool. So this multidimensional approach makes visible the dynamic interplay between conflict behaviors, issues, and attitudes, and enables analysis of the long-term effects of autonomy settlements. And Sunil Bastian and I, in our articles, use state formation as a lens for analyzing the contemporary peace in Sri Lanka. So we argue that the current form of peace must be understood as a form of post-war political order, shaped by long-term historical processes aimed at consolidating the Sri Lankan state that continue to shape peace some 10 years after the war ending. And Gillian Howell, she synthesizes a relational approach to peace with theoretical insights from music, sociology, and ethnomusicology to develop a framework for assessment of peace, of music-based peace-building initiatives, building on a case study from Afghanistan. And the study contributes to how new conceptual developments of peace can be translated into methodological tools and practices. And in the first of the special issues 3 briefings, Veronica Stam and Benny Risa point to a discrepancy in between formal peace building and everyday experiences of peace by studying how war widows in Aceh, in Indonesia, envision and experience peace in their everyday lives. So this study underscores the importance of understanding local ideas about peace by listening to voices seldom heard in order to improve peace building outcomes for the people most affected by war. And focusing on peace and land issues in South Africa, Anna Jarstad considers how poor conflict issues have been dealt with after the end of the war, and how this shapes peace when decades after the peace settlement, in terms of the level of security, health, economic development, and issues of citizenship and belonging. And in the final briefing, Aya Malmale, Etisas Shah, Han-Ying Brinkman, and Victoria von Knobloch present methodologies and data developed at the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office at the request of the UN Secretary General. And this can facilitate identification of gaps in peacebuilding practice, and also greater coordination between peacebuilding actors, and provide a basis for discussions about the meaning of peace and the goals that peacebuilding should support. So to sum up, the special issue contributes in 3 key respects. First, contributions expands and deepens our understanding of varieties of peace by providing a rich and empirical analysis that generates better and more nuanced understandings of what peace looks like, how it is envisioned and experienced in a range of post-war contexts. So this advances the nature and variation of peace. Second, special issue contributions provide new knowledge about how varying manifestations of peace can be explained. By analyzing political settlements after war and historic state formation processes, they provide a better understanding to why certain forms of peace emerged in particular contexts and what factors shapes variation in the character of peace. And third, the special issue makes distinctly methodological contributions through the development of novel analytical frameworks and methods for the study of peace. And finally, the contributions use a diversity of analytical approaches for characterizing peace and for understanding what shapes it, including everyday peace, state formation, the arts, zones of peace, to mention a few. So as this implies, the article speaks to different ongoing conversations in the peace and peace-building literature, and engages with contemporary debates, including on conceptualizing and measuring peace, the coexistence of war and peace, practices, experiences and outcome of everyday peace, the arts and peace building in the visual turn, and the politics of competing visions of peace.
So, thank you, Malin. During the rest of this launch event, we will hear from one of the authors in the special issue, Dr. Nilanjana Premaratna from Umeå University, who's been a postdoc in the Varieties of Peace program, and will present her article as one example of the innovative and really nice contributions that we have in this issue that we hope you will all go on and read afterwards. And thereafter, we will hear from 3 distinguished scholars in the field who has been given the task to reflect on how the special issue advances the study of peace. And we indeed hope that they think it does in some way. That remains to be seen. And also how the special issue points to new directions in peace research, or maybe what the gaps are that the special issue doesn't express or address that we should all focus on in our future research. So the discussants are Professor Timothy Sisk from the University of Denver, Professor Marie-Jo El-Sahar from the University of Montreal, and Dr. Erin McCandless from the University of Witwatersrand. And after that, we expect to still have some time for audience questions and discussion. So some housekeeping. This event is held in Zoom webinar as opposed to a regular meeting. So as you have probably noticed already, attendees are muted and you cannot turn on your cameras. So you need to request permission to speak if you want to verbally ask a question. But if you do so, it's good to be aware that the webinar is recorded. So if you don't want to be heard or seen in the recording, then you don't have to. But if you ask a question, you will be heard or seen. And we recommend using the Q&A function to type questions or use it to ask permission to ask a question verbally, and then I can give you the word later in the Q&A. But to write questions, if you have a question on your mind now, or when you listen to the discussions or to Nila, then you can type it right away and we'll get back to it later. And after today, we of course hope that you will want to stay in touch with us. So please have a look at our webpage to find out more about what's going on in the Varieties of Peace network. And you can also join the network, of course, on the webpage. That means you will receive newsletters and you can advertise your own new work that is related to peace through the network. You can also follow us on Twitter. Yeah. And with that, I will give the word to our author presenter, Dr. Nilanjana Premaratna.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Let me figure out the screen sharing. Do I have permission to share the screen, Elisabeth? Otherwise, we could you could do the PowerPoint and.
I think you should have permission, but if it doesn't seem to work, I will get to it right away.
Somehow, yeah, it would be actually great if you could. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Elisabeth and Malin, for inviting me to talk about my article today and for having included me in the special issue. I will present the argument first and then locate the paper within the relevant academic debates and the Sri Lankan context. I will briefly outline the methods I used, go into the discussion, and finally summarize the contributions. Can we go to the next slide, Elisabeth? Thank you. Thank you. So this would be the outline of my structure for the presentation today. Thank you. So my main argument is that documentary film contributes to peace research and peace building by offering multiple viewpoints that elucidate varied understandings of peace in post-war societies. As I will discuss more in a few minutes, I look at documentary film from three angles. Documentary film as text, as peace building process, and as visual elicitation in peace research. Next slide, please. Thank you. The article intervenes in and contributes to larger debates in visual politics, varieties of peace, and post-war peace building and development in Sri Lanka. The arts have gained increasing attention as an approach for peace building and development in the recent years. Despite documentary film's popularity among peacebuilding practitioners, there is limited research on documentary film in peacebuilding. That is partly because the visual turn in international relations has so far focused on war more than peace, and has shown relatively limited interest in documentary film compared to other visual media, such as photography and film. The recent work of scholars such as Sophie Harmon and William Callahan have started changing this situation. Documentary film is highly relevant for peace studies. As an art product, it can convey, problematize, and inspire specific notions of peace through its engagement with the audience. As an audiovisual method, film allows researchers to go beyond the limits of verbal interaction and tap into participants' embodied value systems. This plurality in method and interpretation makes documentary film a medium that allows us to gain a nuanced understanding of what peace means in different settings among different communities. To explore documentary film's role in the study and practice of peace building, I used Demons in Paradise, a controversial documentary film released in 2017, directed by Jude Rathnam, a Sri Lankan Tamil filmmaker. Next slide, please. Thank you. While the root causes of the Sri Lankan conflict are debated, there is general consensus on the key parties of the war. The majority Sinhalese-led Sri Lankan government and the Tamil ethno-nationalist group Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The war revolved around claims for a Tamil homeland in the Tamil-speaking north and east of the country. The LTTE achieved a hegemonic status as the sole representative of Tamil nationalism. The civil war ended in 2009 with the government's military victory over the LTTE. The post-war government adopted a peace through development strategy with a strong focus on major infrastructure development projects, including rebuilding railways, highways, and urban development and tourism projects in the former war zones. This approach was problematic for neglecting the emotional trauma and political character of the conflict. Developmental peace devoid of political reform has led to increased tension and securitization, as we have seen in many other contexts. Next slide, please. Thank you. To understand the role of documentary film in the study and practice of peace building, I discussed Demons in Paradise from 3 analytical angles. Firstly, I examined Demons in Paradise as a text for its take on peace, using the film reviews and interviews with the director. Secondly, I explored how the film was deliberately used in the peace building process. The Strengthening Reconciliation Process in Sri Lanka, funded by the German Corporation for International Cooperation, GIZ, screened the film around the country to promote public dialogue around peace and reconciliation. I attended screenings and post-screening discussions, but also interviewed the organizers and audience members. Thirdly, I used Demons in Paradise as an audiovisual method to elicit community-specific ideas of peace through 4 semi-structured focus groups held in Sri Lanka during November and December 2019. I chose a Muslim group from the Eastern Province, a Tamil group from the Northern Province, a Sinhala group from the Southern Province, and a Hill Country group from the plantation sector in the Central Province. In the focus groups, I explored key themes the participants identified in the film, where they felt moved and whether they saw a connection with the film and peace in their community. Next slide, please. Thanks. Demons in Paradise explores the conflict through the director Jude Rathnam's and his uncle's memories around the conflict and presents an internal narrative of the Tamil liberation movement. The director's journey starts with fleeing to Jaffna as a 5-year-old to escape the 1983 anti-Tamil riots. His uncle, a former member of a Maoist Tamil militant group, returns to Sri Lanka from Canada and travels with the director, tracing significant memories, people, and places in his transition from civilian to militant to migrant. The film questions the development-oriented peace building deployed during the post-war period by showing how reconstructing the overland road to Jaffna, seen as a major step towards peace, has led to war tourism from the south. Through interviews and discussions, Rathnam shows how the LTTE used violence to gain hegemonic status, instilling pervasive emotional cultures of fear within the community. The film suggests critical self-reflection and contemplation that re-examines the intra-Tamil violence as a vital first step for healing and sustaining peace. Next slide, please. Thank you. The idea of peace conveyed through the film was shaped by the peace-building process. The 2 screenings I attended were conducted for a mostly Sinhala audience. The panel discussions located the film within the conflict history and critiqued its limited portrayal of state violence and the need for a balanced view. These discussions were characterized by the need to empathize the other, liberal notions of peace, and at times nationalist sentiments. Alternative conceptions of peace were expressed mostly through audience interviews. How peace can mean different things depending on your circumstances, and peace as the freedom to dissent are some of these examples. Next slide, please. Thank you. As this quote shows, the discussion, this is a quote from an audience member in PERADENIYA, one of the screenings I attended. The discussion indicated the lack of space for alternative views within the prevailing peace-building discourse, where liberal values tend to regulate what was seen as permissible. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, I analyzed how documentary film can be used in research to elicit collective ideas of peace. I screened the film to 4 ethnogeographically bounded communities in Sri Lanka, as I discussed earlier, in the northern, eastern, southern, and central provinces. Peace is a sensitive and highly politicized topic in the country. The film provided an alternative entry point and acted as a shared creative referent for the focus group discussions. Participants saw the film for the first time at the focus group. Unanticipated readings of peace emerged through the process. For example, the Southern group interpreted the film's narrative as a call for the younger Tamils to take up arms. Some in the Northern group argued that the film is irrelevant because peace in Sri Lanka means peace between ethnicities. The Southern group associated peace with the military and questioned how the film could relate to peace when it does not talk about the military at all. All the groups talked about the intercommunal nature of peace in relation to the scene where Ratnam's uncle meets a Sinhala family, which protected him during a riot. Also, all the groups commented on how nationalist discourses and political influences breed enmity between the communities. The last slide, please. Thank you. To sum up, I explored the role of documentary film in this article by conducting an empirical analysis of demons in paradise in Sri Lanka, along 3 analytical angles. In doing so, the article makes conceptual, methodological, and empirical contributions to peace research and peace building. I established documentary film as a site to theorize peace, showing how documentary film produces plural, disparate conceptions of peace through 3 analytical angles. I responded to Roland Bleicher's call to adopt pluralist methods in visual politics by drawing from an array of methods and materials. The analysis juxtaposed varied applications of documentary film, charting new pathways for research on and through documentary film. The research facilitated empirically informed theorizations of peace in relation to Sri Lanka. The ideas of peace that emerged through the process can help develop appropriate, responsive peace-building initiatives that engage with communities from where they are. The community-specific notions of peace tie in with and strengthen Malin Åkebo's research on regional variations of peace as well. In conclusion, documentary film offers a range of pathways through which we can understand, elicit, and inform plural visions of peace in post-war contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nila. Okay, so it's time for our discussants then. I don't know if Tim and Erin, if you have decided between you who's to go first. All right, go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm going to go first. Greetings, everyone, and congratulations to Varieties of Peace for this really important issue, and just, for the really great work that you're doing across the board on so many different fronts, and the kind of inspiration you've mobilized around a new approach to looking at peace, which is really so critical, and you're doing it in such a dedicated way. So we really appreciate that. And I'm very honored to be part of the conversation and to have Varieties of Peace be collaborating with JPD, Journal of Peacebuilding and Development. So I'm one of the founders and an editor for about 15 years, not on this issue, but many before. And the journal, really seeks to serve as a forum for sharing critical thinking and constructive action on issues at the intersections of conflict, development, and peace. And in particular, we've sought to kind of focus on asymmetric power relations between North and South in ways that influence, shape, and reframe discussions around peace building and development. And we've always sought to carve space for alternative voices to counter the dominant paradigms. And while the concern for looking at the local and examining local politics and local narratives has grown over the last decade, this has been something that's been at the core of our mission for 2 decades. So, realizing this vision has demanded that we operate as a journal in very different ways, and collaborate with partners who are also very interested in having this kind of lens or focus to our work. So all of this to highlight that, the focus of this, of Voices, Varieties of Peace on truly engaging local contexts and looking at relational peace is very much in line with what we've sought to do as a journal. So we're delighted to have this partnership. So I'm going to say a few words on several of the articles. And we've kind of divided it up between the three of us because looking at so many is very difficult. They're very rich, but my colleagues will speak on whatever they like as well. So I've focused on the Cambodia piece and the Sri Lanka piece by Malin and Sunil, and the piece on South Africa, the briefing on South Africa, which is where I live right now for the last 3 years. So it's an important piece for me too. So first on Cambodia, really quite an interesting piece. And Sung Yong Lee, his goal is to move beyond examining the practices and strategies of everyday peace building, which is kind of a lot of the focus of many scholars, to really understand the character of the peace and the outcomes by looking at the reconstruction of relationships between the Khmer Rouge, former Khmer Rouge leaders and their members of local communities and other members of local communities in Cambodia. And he kind of finds that 3 features, which are plurality, subtlety, and connectivity, characterize the everyday peace. And his investigation, really illustrates the significant variance of views on peace within and between local communities that's shaped on the interactions between them in the wider political context, and notably the dynamism of peace as it's shaped by and through these interactions. So it's very rich, and what real takeaway for me is that he's got a lot of experience doing research in these communities, and it just reveals how absolutely vital qualitative, deep, rich studies are of context, and that they really need to be undertaken by actors extremely familiar with the context. So I'll come back a bit more to some of his work. But in Sri Lanka, Malin and Sunil argue that Sri Lanka's situation is not best described by failed liberal peace building, as many have argued, but rather that the post-war peace has been shaped by ongoing competitive processes of state formation to consolidate the Sri Lankan state, with authority being imposed, challenged, and renegotiated. And I really like the focus on state formation, or I'm not sure why we don't call it state building in this context, to explore Sri Lanka's variety of peace. Our field, one of my concerns is that our field is moving in a direction that worries me from time to time, which is where so much is framed around liberal and non-liberal, when the heterogeneity, and that creates, this duality, when in fact we really want to dig into the heterogeneity to better understand, precisely the type of variety of peace that your organization, that your project is really looking at. So along this line, I would love to see the authors and others generally, better unpack the liberal peace in particular contexts, and for scholars to be critically distinguishing, for example, between, when is poor development the result of growth and austerity-oriented policies associated with neoliberalism, or when is it actually a response of bad governance, right? Where this, for example, the Sinhala state deliberately pursues uneven development between 2 identity groups and fosters horizontal inequalities that feed into the nature and character of peace. And the authors also look at socioeconomic outcomes, which is important. But in this context, I would also argue that it's vital to really understand the differential impacts on different identity groups, which is so crucial for understanding standpoint relationships. This is very difficult, right? Because we need disaggregated data by ethnicity, and it's very, very hard to find in different contexts. It's extremely difficult when you're doing comparative research, because oftentimes there's good research in one context, but not in others. And I really like the emphasis on state-society relations, but would suggest that this is its own dimension. The authors look at minority-state relationship. And, I know Tim's also doing a lot of work on social cohesion, and myself, I am as well, and the social contract. And we really unpack relationships vertically and horizontally in quite a comprehensive way. And so that would, I think in terms of examining the Sinhala Tamil relationship with the state, we could really look at a lot more types of relationships. And I think this is important when we are trying to foster a more nationally owned and grounded understanding of state building. And then in South Africa, Anna Jarstad, she in her short, really fascinating briefing considering unresolved land issues dating back to the apartheid era, and how this shapes the current peace, notably because of the adverse consequences for those living in high density areas and informal settlements, the landless poor. And she cites adverse consequences and as insecurity, impacts on health and economic development. And while she does not go too much into theorizing the relational peace in this context, probably size of the briefing, and you know, I know she's working on this more as well. You know, this is really crucial, I think, in terms of understanding the relational and structural dimensions. And in fact, I looked at this precisely on the issue of land in Zimbabwe 2 decades ago, before the infamous land occupations. That, like in South Africa, were a consequence of sort of this fruitless approach to willing seller, willing buyer, and didn't turn up anything in Zimbabwe. And, you know, I used reconciliation and justice theories to frame my study, and my main finding was that the characteristics of such characteristics such as partnership, active friendship, and trust in relationships, kind of higher order representations than coexistence, for example, were deeply tied to the fact that economic justice had in no way been achieved for the great majority of Zimbabweans. So similar conclusions can be drawn in South Africa, and research I'm conducting on social cohesion shows that indicators of trust and belonging, core to the achievement of South Africa's Rainbow Nation collective identity, are declining as inequality and poverty deepen 25 years post-apartheid. So, you know, I'd like to challenge VOP colleagues to bring this justice angle and inequality more into the study of relational peace. And I'm curious how if you're thinking about that and how. So 3 final overarching comments. And, you know, as we study the varieties of peace, you know, the question is, where can we place common value given by local actors across societies on social justice, issues of inequality, and the desire for well-being? So, for example, in the Sri Lanka study, the Cambodia study, you know, Sun Young Lee said that most interviewees suggested that they wanted to move on from the conflict and were primarily concerned with economic hardship and livelihoods. And in Malin and Sunil's piece in Sri Lanka, reference to protests arising is also illustrative, suggesting widespread resistance to socioeconomic challenges. So the question I think that could be further explored, which I'm doing also in some of my work, is how can protest movements, you know, be galvanizing social processes from below across identity and social groups in ways that serve peace? And for Varieties of Peace Project, you know, how will these increasingly widespread confrontational approaches affect the variety of peace in different contexts? And then secondly, around outcomes, and this is raised in Sun Young Lee's paper, but it also raises the question for me more generally across the Varieties of Peace project, as it deeply and rightly so challenges efforts to measure peace across countries, right? So I'd have liked to have seen perhaps his analysis more developed, like a macro analysis of the quality and nature and peace given the plurality. Is it possible through a Varieties of Peace methodology to qualitatively assess the quality of peace overall in any kind of comparative way? So that's a tough one, I'm sure. And then lastly, around state-society relations, you know, again, with this very much liberal peace concern that is dominating our field, you know, there's a tendency to write off the state. And in so doing, with considerable attention to the local turn, I feel that we've not given enough sufficient attention to state-society relations. So Sun Young Lee's piece, for example, argues that plurality, subtlety, and connectivity influence how the wider institutional arrangements settle in local areas. I would like to see the research from the other angle. How do communities influence the nature of institutions to better serve and reflect their needs? And I feel we need to do more work in the study of peace to understand the state-society dynamics and how people and communities interact with state institutions. So I'd love to see you working more in that area too. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over now.
Thank you very much, Erin. Let's leave the word to Tim then.
Yeah, thank you, Elisabeth. And I want to start by congratulating Elisabeth and Malin for bringing this project to fruition and this special issue on Varieties of Peace. I was fortunate to be in on the sort of initial work on this, I believe back at the ISA meeting, whether it was 2018 or 2019, I can't remember, in the post-pandemic era. But nonetheless, congratulations to them and to the authors indeed, and to Nilanjana, who's on the call today. with regard to this special issue. Look, this is a really interesting development, and I would say it's a development that parallels a bit what we've seen in the work on democracy and governance through the VDEM project, which has really captured a lot of the space in terms of monitoring democracy around the world, that we have varieties of democracy, we have varieties of peace. And this is, I think, a very important new development to help chart that, as Erin suggested. I'll begin my remarks first with a little introductory comments on the context, and then 3 insights that I see in the special issue, and then some concluding comments that relate very much to what Erin just mentioned in her discussion of this material. So, back to the introduction, I think we're all acutely aware of the effects of the COVID pandemic on underlying structural conditions around the world. And we've seen this articulated from the highest levels of the UN just in the past days and week or so. Just yesterday, the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, spoke before the General Assembly, and then last week in Zimbabwe, and captured the term of the inequality of virus, and that is the widespread and expected deep effects of the COVID pandemic on inequalities around the world. And the reason why I mention this is I think what we're witnessing is a very rapid change in the nature of conflict drivers. And particularly this question, I think that Erin rightly posed on inequality and so-called relative deprivation. So if we see widening root cause drivers of conflict around the world, the changes in the nature of conflict as a result of these really deep structural effects globally imply that there'll be changes in the variety of peace. And so this is, the changing nature of conflict and the changing nature of peace are very much the sort of zeitgeist in which we're working. And this special issue, I think, really provides the opportunity to ask the question of, in this new context, what is positive peace? We have issues of polarization, resource competition, populism and nationalism, all of which resonate in this material. So as we get into this question, what is positive peace? I think this is where the special issue is really particularly useful. I mean, the goals were to explore, right, the varieties, and I think that goal was met very well in terms of a really wide range of cases and contexts, to look at relational dynamics. And here, we've had a long understanding that peace is related to elite dynamics, but less so on the sort of quotidian or daily interactions. And so that essay on Cambodia by Suyong Lee, which Erin mentioned, I think is really an example of this kind of granular research that is shown in this issue. And finally, the third goal here was to develop this sort of notion of varieties. And what I was kind of interested in is that this is not a typology. There are typological implications of this work, but it's not a typology as such. And I think that is one of the benefits of this special issue. So I would say there are 3 insights that I drew from this special issue, and we'll focus particularly on the work by Mimi Sirber-Kovac and Christina Höglund and Melida Jimenez on the Philippines. First of all, the first insight that I would say is the one that we've all understood for some time, but this really highlights this kind of critical issue, and that is that there is peace is dependent on path dependency, right? That and this provides certain constraints for peace. The nature of the political settlement often inhibits a social contract, as Erin has rightly shown in her work, that we see that these kind of constraints are well known, and Andre Jarstad's look at the land issue in South Africa is also indicative of this. But what this work shows is that there are also opportunities in this path dependency world of ours with regard to peace processes, and that certain pathways may open up opportunities for peace. So why do certain forms of peace emerge? And this is a special issue, I think, provides us with some insights for sort of sub-insights in this broader path dependency question. And the first is that patterns of escalation are different. You know, other research has shown so-called equifinality in the way in which a state failure occurs. And we see in this a special issue sort of very wide ranging understanding of the patterns of escalation from, say, Syria to Sri Lanka. And secondly, that there are varieties of stalemates. This is something my colleague Marie-Joëlle Zahara certainly worked on a lot in terms of the nature of stalemates, this question of ripeness of conflicts for peace making and eventually for peace building. And the nature of stalemate, I think, is indicative in this particular special issue around the work of zones of peace and civilian protection in zones of peace, which I found to be a fascinating article by Anders Nordhog in this special issue. And thirdly, the sort of insight from path dependency that I see is on the nature of a settlement. And I'll come back to this question of autonomy agreements and the extent to which autonomy agreements may be inherently unstable, I think is a very important insight with strong policy implications. And then finally, this issue of pathways helps us chart incentives for peace. And this is very interesting in the article in the special issue on the briefing actually by Veronica Strand and Benny Yusriza on Banda Aceh, that there's this huge disconnect between a focus and experiences on the broader political settlement and the overall sort of substructure and the daily lived experiences of peace. So path dependency, we think about this, but path dependency leads us to this notion of variation in peace, and that it provides both constraints, but also opportunities to work at these alternate levels as opposed to working solely in terms of political settlements and elite dynamics. Well, the second insight that I drew is also one that is not necessarily new, but is further developed in this special issue. And that is that peace is unstable, right? And we just pull the headlines right out of today's news with regard to South Sudan and warnings from the United Nations with regard to the imminent collapse of the political settlement and return to wide-scale violence in South Sudan. And here I think that absolutely what the special issue does is show us that this notion of contested peace, that peace agreements can be highly unstable, and certain types of peace agreements are particularly unstable. And so that's why I was very, very interested in this important contribution on the Bangsamoro region by, as I mentioned, our colleagues here, this notion of contested peace, how peace leads to new conflict issues. And just to substantiate this piece of scholarship, just on April 15th of this year, the International Crisis Group released a major report on the Bangsamoro region. And it was, could have been taken almost right out of this article in terms of the insights from the academic research leading right into the kind of early warning systems globally. The crisis group suggested a raised risk of violence. It pointed to the continued presence of armed groups. And in fact, the key conclusion of the crisis group report was very much in line and complementary to this scholarly research that in the Bangsamoro region is yet to achieve a stable peace. So if we see in this policy and early warning literature these notions of what constitutes a so-called stable peace, then this special issue gives us really insights into really the varieties of stability and the extent to which certain types of peace agreements like territorially based peace agreements. So I dare throw in the case of Ethiopia in this, as that these are highly unstable agreements and may lead to some questioning about the types of political settlements that lead to territorial outcomes, territorial autonomy outcomes. Might also toss in Bosnia in this regard as well. So the third insight that I drew from the work of the special issue, and indeed in the Varieties of Peace project overall, is that we have a real kind of contradiction. And the contradiction has to do with what we all understand, I think, as critically important, that Varieties of Peace is related to this awful piece of jargon that we have in the literature and that comes out well in the policy discourse. And it's called context specificity, right? So we have all of these measures, as we've seen the Peacebuilding Support Office developing these 40 very detailed measures of types of interventions and arenas of intervention. But we also have this kind of parallel and the ability to sort of mark progress on those, to say that 43% of all ODA spending is on SDG 16. This is all great stuff as far as I'm concerned, a little nerdy on these things. But if we have, on the one hand, varieties of peace and context specificity, yet on the other hand, we have the ability or the interest in tracking progress on the SDGs and comparing across countries and having, a whole set of indicators, then you sort of lose that context specificity. So where does this leave us? And particularly what then is peace building if everything is context specific? We have all of the sort of bottom-up approaches, and we have top-down measuring. To me, this is highly contradictory, or at least it's a conundrum for those in the peace-building field. So we look at the sort of broader global tracking of SDG 16, and particularly, I think what is most important here that is drawn from this special issue is the importance of I'll get a little nerdy and technical on you, SDG target 16.7, which is on inclusive governance, right? That the variety of regimes that we see out there that have emerged from different peace agreements means that inclusive governance takes place under a variety of conditions of marginalization, of identity disputes, of resource disputes. And so back to this a study on Bangsamoro, I think this is really interesting to show that, and the key conclusion of this article was the need to move from peace agreement to social contract. And that sounds awfully familiar, I think, as Erin would suggest, that in each of these context-specific events, I think really situations, really this work on varieties of peace is helpful, because we can focus then right on the key issues of exclusion, of marginalized groups, and of the resource dimensions, to think about what constitutes a social contract within each of these contexts. So the insight, again, the third insight is very much that there's a need for both. There's a need for the broader SDG 16 tracking to see sort of longitudinal development of context, but really the need to go right down to the sort of regional focus group level, as Nilanjana did with her research on the documentary film. Well, let me conclude by saying that when a special issue occurs or research material comes out, that it's better not to talk about what was missed or what was wrong with the research, but rather what the insights may be and how this may lead to new directions. I was completely animated by the application of the 2010 framework of the peace triangle, right, of issues, behaviors, and attitudes as a way to get to this question of variation. Variation in issues, absolutely. Variation in behaviors and in attitudes, and how this affects the peace. For the reader, for those on the call, you'll find this peace triangle on page 58 of the special issue. And I thought it just really worked well, because what it did is it leads to the varieties that we see, and the varieties that we see, I think, are articulated well the nature of an unjust peace, right? That peace is the absence of violence in the context of injustice, as the Human Rights Group report yesterday on Palestine suggested, that stability is not necessarily peace. And this is a longstanding understanding in the literature, but this special issue really brings this out well. The second kind of context that we see is polarized peace, and sometimes we get into the language of so-called frozen conflicts, and it's exactly right along these lines that we also see that fragmented outcomes are not necessarily peaceful outcomes, and that polarized peace is also an unstable condition. And then the final category of fearful peace, I think, is very interesting, and here we get to the to the question of conflict recurrence, and again of how peace agreements and peaceful situations relapse into violence, this question of recurrence. So where does this all leave us? It leaves us with the varieties of peace leads to potential opportunities for peace building. And to conclude, I would say there are really three of them. One is innovative approaches. And so I really like this public discourse approach that Nilanjana pursued in Sri Lanka, where not only are we understanding peace building better by sort of close-in focus groups with key targeted groups in that context, but it also suggests that this kind of research can be, in a way, intervention research, which we could talk about further. I did think that a little more focus on countering inequality would be important to understanding the varieties of peace, and here I'm back to the implications of COVID around countering inequality. And I think one of the most important aspects that we see in the field of positive peace is the importance of remediating horizontal inequalities. And these horizontal inequalities, again, sorry for the jargon on that, but the overlap between identity and economic opportunity and economic conditions, as Erin mentioned with regard to landless in South Africa, is that without countering inequality, yeah, peace is very uncertain and tenuous and fearful. And so I think that this is something that we focus on. And third, the area that I might have wanted to see just a little more was grappling to a certain extent with rights-based approaches to peace building. How does the varieties of peace orientation help us understand the conditions under which external actors like the UN or some of those that were indicated as funded by the UN Peacebuilding Fund in the article on the UN, the briefing at the very end of the special issue. What are the implications for rights-based approaches? Is it possible that that what cross-cuts each of these areas of incomplete or unstable or unjust or polarized peace is the need for rights-based approaches and a revival of rights-based approaches in this field? But that's a longer conversation. I once again want to just congratulate the authors and the editors of this special issue. It's going right on to my advanced graduate seminar syllabus on conflict and peace building in our very uncertain era. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. All right, I'll leave the word to Marie-Joëlle.
Well, first of all, thank you both for the opportunity to actually read these fascinating articles. One usually does not thank their colleagues for piling up more work at the end of the term, but this was actually really pleasurable. And as I think, both Erin and Tim have already said, important work. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you also to Erin and Tim for allowing me to go last, because while I don't want to criticize the issue, and I do not also want to delve into each of the articles separately, what I want to do is actually think about what Varieties of Peace has already done, what it can do, but where it can also potentially get mired and maybe get us to think about how we can avoid that. And I will be echoing some of the things that Erin and Tim have already said. It's a difficult act to follow, but I asked to do that, so the bad's on me. So usually when a new concept or a new idea is introduced, we tend to measure its effectiveness a number of ways. Does it sound familiar? Does it resonate? Is it coherent? Does it provide actually analytical depth? Do we feel like it allows us to have both, you know, a potential for comparison, but at the same time context specificity? How useful, what is its utility in the field, therefore in relationship to other concepts? And does it help us, you know, basically observe the world in concrete terms? I haven't invented any of these. These are, you know, my own, you know, simplification of the criteria that John Gehring has actually given us when we think about concept formation. And I think it's interesting here to connect with the VDEM project that Tim mentioned, because on the one hand, Varieties of Peace has clearly already made its mark, particularly in terms of its ability to get us to think about all these important, and they're not nuances, they're differences in the quality of peace and what that means, both for the stability of agreements, for the ability to move away from certain paths that countries have become dependent on, what have you, for the nature of social contracts, but also actually, it has allowed us to look into the contents of peace as opposed to just thinking about how peace comes about, which is very much what other labels such as liberal peace, hybrid peace, everyday peace have actually done. All of these focus more on how peace comes about, the practices at the local level, the ideology at the international level, the interactions between locals and internationals, but it doesn't tell us much about what the content of peace is. And I think that the amazing and extremely important contribution of this program is to actually interrogate content and to think about what that means, both for the quality of peace, but also, as Tim suggested, for potential recurrence of instability, what have you, and as Erin mentioned, for important normative issues such as social justice and so on. So I'm not going to say more than that because it seems to me that the achievements are clear. I do think, however, that as the program grows, and I've also, like Tim, been fortunate to be associated with it from the very beginning. And I actually want to thank Anna Jarstad, who I know is in the audience, for the opportunity, because she's the one who invited me actually to be on the advisory board of the initial project at Umeå. Having seen that, having been associated with it, as it grows, I can see potential hurdles for the program to overcome. And I want to actually highlight those and connect them to some of the things in the articles. The first is thinking about the utility of Varieties of Peace, its relationship with other concepts in the field, whether it's quality peace, the Wallenstein, relational peace, everyday peace, some of which are used by various authors in their contributions. They're used extremely well, but how they connect to Varieties of Peace, what Varieties of Peace brings that is additional, is not always highlighted as much as I think it could have been. And therefore, the question of the added value, I think, needs now to be front and center. What is it that we're gaining as we're using this notion, whether in conjunction with or in an attempt to distinguish what you, your colleagues, we collectively do as opposed to other types of approaches. And here, for example, the article by Malin and Sunil that clearly sets up, for example, liberal peace versus state formation, actually gives us analytical purchase. It shows us how thinking about varieties of peace has allowed us to bring in an absolutely new perspective to the way in which people understand what is going on currently in Sri Lanka. I would also want to highlight that as we think about concepts and the relation between various concepts in a semantic field, such as the field of peace, there is another paradox, I guess, which is that as much as the initial distinction, which you very rightly criticized between positive peace and negative peace as something which is very simplistic and in many ways analytically harmful, not just not useful, I won't say useless. That initial distinction comes back to us because there is a danger as we think about varieties of peace, not to ask ourselves, what is the threshold? At what point is something peaceful? Not really peace. What do we mean by peace? And there is a danger, and that's a danger that the VDEM project and broader programs on democracy research have actually faced head on. There is a danger that as we multiply the adjectives that we associate with peace, we are both either stretching the concept or basically trying to use different measures as a way to escape the difficulty of defining what we think are the core elements of peace. And that, particularly going back to discussions about injustice, social contracting, rights-based approaches, I think is something essential. And it brings me to my third set of comments, and that is about indicators. And here I was really struck by the absolute contradiction between the last contribution in the briefing, so the UN approach to try and measure, what constitutes peace building, and I will call them indicators for lack of a better word, that you have in the Cambodia piece on issues of plurality, subtlety, connectivity. And that, I think, does raise two sets of issues. The first set of issues is that it seems to me that one of the values of the Varieties of Peace program is that it allows us to move away from basic, concrete, measurable, indicators such as number of deaths, or number of violent incidents, or number of houses being rebuilt. It moves us towards more qualitative, and I would say more normative assessments, more fine-grained, fine-tuned assessments of what peace is. And in many ways, that is very consonant, of course, with the work of your colleagues at Uppsala around the quality of peace, right? But these measures tend to be very context-specific. They also tend to be very difficult to translate into something that is understandable by the organizations, countries, donors that actually conduct peace building. And therefore, the question of the impact of your work, which is important work, on the practices of others, is something that one needs to think about. I'm not saying that we need to actually move away from these fine-grained indicators, but there needs to be a way to assess in a more tangible sense what different varieties of peace mean. And that's where I think that indicators like the ones that were highlighted by Erin and Tim, such as, rights. Is there, basic respect for rights across the board in a country? Or are rights, for example, the preserve of one community or one part of the country as opposed to others? Justice. Is justice served at what levels? Who has access to justice? It seems to me that these are the indicators that need to be privileged over the really interesting and intriguing notions of, for example, plurality, subtlety, connectivity, and other notions that have been raised in other articles. I don't want to necessarily focus on this one, but this one provides me with a good stepping stone for these comments, which, although extremely interesting, are more difficult when it comes to crossing the thresholds between analysis and recommendations and practice. And I do think that a lot of what the Varieties of Peace program was born of was actually deep dissatisfaction, both with the state of the field academically, but also with the state of practice. And therefore, it would be a loss of opportunity if all of this amazing research was not read simply because it was not intelligible to the practitioners. And I guess that both Tim and Erin, who have as long, if not longer, engagement with practitioners as I do, totally understand what I'm trying to get at here. Without giving details or names, I only a couple of years ago sat in a room where academics and practitioners were talking across each other, even though what they were both saying needed to be heard by the other. And therefore, the issue of mutual intelligibility in this field, I think, is something absolutely important that we should not lose sight of. And therefore, I would push not so much the special issue, but the rest of the program going ahead to think really carefully about indicators that would be intelligible to the practitioner community, while at the same time not sacrificing this fine-grained assessment that you're trying to do. I have, I guess, two other sets of comments. One on sources. I was extremely pleased to see all of the articles and briefings be reflexive about their methodology and spend an unusual amount of time for academic articles describing how the research was actually conducted. And that is something that I absolutely want to praise, because I think that it's a transparency that is needed and that is all the more important nowadays as qualitative research has come recently under criticism for some of its practices, including, for example, our inability sometimes for the security of our respondents to give people access to interviews and to the primary material that we've collected. Now, thankfully, this debate is being solved in a reasonable way, but that does actually suggest that we need to be a bit more explicit about how we conduct our research. Now, having said that, I do think, and I think both Erin and Tim have actually highlighted this, that there is both potential constraints, but also missed opportunities when our sources derive from only one perspective, whereas a lot of what the Varieties of Peace program is trying to do is to highlight relations. And therefore, for example, I thought that the Syria article, while extremely transparent on the fact that most of the sources were quite biased in favor of, Rojava, did not, in my opinion, go far enough in trying to ascertain how that is perceived by others. And it's interesting because I won't necessarily, question the findings here, but in Iraq, in the Iraqi Kurdistan nearby, where people initially talked about Kurdistan as this democratic and plural society, over years, we have actually seen that under the label of a Kurdish nation, there was actually significant minority discrimination, even as minorities were allowed to live in the midst of the Kurdish majorities. And therefore, I mean, it seems to me there is a potential for similar things to be happening in Rojava. I actually have sources from my own knowledge of the Syria case that suggest that is the case. But unfortunately, the kind of documents that are available, and here I think that Anders does not really have much choice in terms of availability of articles, and research cannot be conducted currently in Rojava. I have a PhD candidate who is working on the same area and facing the same problems in terms of access to data. But I do think that what that means is that it would be extremely interesting for this research actually to be revisited a couple of years down the line to see if the analysis continues to hold, particularly because the research stopped in 2014 and we are already in 2021. And there have been a number of things that have happened in the meantime that could affect the analysis. I would also say, for example, Nilanjana, I would love to see you at one point screen the documentary with the military. I don't know whether that's feasible, but it would be extremely interesting given, what the other article on Sri Lanka says about, the importance of the military and state formation considerations. It would be really interesting not to look simply at the communities, but also to look at categories of actors and how they see peace. I don't know whether that is already in your program. I see that you are a postdoc. I hope that you will have the opportunity to do that, because I think it would be interesting to have a cross-cutting reading of how not just communities at the base, but also the political actors who have decisional power are also looking at this and reacting to this. And of course, I mean, much as I thought it was fascinating, the article on musicology has a very specific perspective on the Zohra ensemble. Which is a perspective of those involved in this ensemble. But it would be interesting to see how traditional, communities within Afghanistan react to this, not just how they understand themselves, but how they are understood, not just by the international community, but also by various constituencies within the country. Now, what that actually gets me to is my last set of comments. And it has to do with choices, hard choices. When the Varieties of Peace program at the time started, it was interested in investigating the nature of what happened after peace agreements. And it started from, I think, the important intuition that it's not because the guns are silent that we really have peace, and not all peace is equivalent, right? If you look now at some of the articles in this issue, the scope has exploded, where we have articles that look at peace in the midst of war. We have articles that look at peace as perceived outside of the countries, international community looking at Zohra, what have you. And I wonder whether in that explosion, there is a stretch that might be harmful to some sort of integrity and to the ability to define, something core that is shared by all of these cases. So where and when seems to me a question that the community needs to ask itself. That does not mean that it cannot continue to be in dialogue with people who do similar work in other settings, whether it is people looking at zones of peace in the midst of war, or people looking at the way in which, you know, peace is perceived by outsiders. But the distinctiveness of the program, I thought, was initially about thinking about what happens post, I will call it, agreement. I think that also raises the question of what violence counts. In the Philippines, and I'm not a Philippines expert, I was interested in seeing blood feuds assessed as part of the violence. In Afghanistan, I can understand that blood feuds have often been instrumentalized, and therefore I could see the connection to the political. But there are so many places where blood feuds are just, you know, a feature of societies organized around clans and whatever. Take, you know, southern Italy. At what point becomes violence, certain types of violence, sorry, let me rephrase this. At what point do certain kinds of violence count for the Varieties of Peace program, and which kind of violence does not count? And then I think that in terms of scope, I am now going to finally contradict myself. And I think that's why I said it's about choices. I can see the multiplicity of choices, but I think, you know, it's for the people working within this program, within this broad network, to think about this. A lot of what was said about, you know, rights, populism, injustice, whatever, suggests that comparison of Varieties of Peace can be extended, not necessarily along the conflict, post-conflict timeline, even though we don't like the word post-conflict and everyone understands why, but along the North-South axis. And that in many ways, Varieties of Peace could be enriched by a comparison, not just of countries in the global South that have lived through violent civil war, as, you know, was initially the basis or the origin of this program, but looking at other kinds of violence that are happening in the streets in the United States, in Canada, in certain countries in Europe, where populism is actually getting a very serious grip, and so on and so forth. So I do think that this is fascinating. I think that it's very clear that this program has been fruitful, that it has actually deepened, it has fruitfully expanded our understanding of what people tend to call summarily positive peace. But it now is at one point where there are choices that need to be made in terms of where it goes next. Some of these choices might actually, I think, run the risk of conceptual stretching of the kind that we saw, for example, with human security, which ended up being abandoned because it became everything and anything, even though the concept in and by itself was useful and important. And that's something I would not want to see the Varieties of Peace program run into. And some of them actually might help you define what is at the core of peace in the variety of contexts in which you work, and maybe help us define not an exclusive definition, but maybe what is an essential component of peace, without which we cannot talk about Varieties of Peace, but we might be talking about varieties of conflict or violence or what have you. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to think about this. I think you've given me a lot to mull over, even beyond this webinar, and I'm grateful for that.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the discussants. It was so interesting listening to you, and I certainly will be thinking about ways forward to continue to study Varieties of Peace along the lines that you laid out. We still have a few minutes for questions. I don't have questions in the Q&A right now, but while you may be typing those questions, I can say that there's a new call for special issues in Journal of Peacebuilding and Development that is out now. So if anyone else is interested in doing what Malin and I did, it's a great choice of journal. They have been providing amazing support, amazing structure to the process, not allowing us to fall behind or forget about things or drop the ball along the process. So it's a really great journal to work with. So check that out if you have ideas of your own for special issues. And in the chat, you can read from Anna, who is also one of the founding members of the Varieties of Peace Network, about some stuff that is going on and upcoming events in the network. Still no questions in the Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, be quick to note that you want the word. Tim raised his hand, so I will give Tim the floor.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. I just wanted to follow up on some comments of Marie-Joëlle and Erin, and hopefully as you work further on Varieties of Peace, to just raise a few of the methodological issues that Marie-Joëlle rightly highlighted. I think in this area, the one sort of key measure that is so difficult to find when you're doing case-specific research is this measure that could be called social distance. And social distance comes to us from social psychology, you know, how close or distant do people feel from the police, from other groups, from your neighbors, from your kids. You know, social distance as a sort of multifaceted measure. And yet I find very difficult, I'd be very keen to know from the other colleagues on the call, you know, outside of a few very micro studies, we don't really have, as far as I understand, a kind of global, a comparative understanding of this concept of social distance, because you could be alienated, isolated, marginalized, and yet not willing to engage in violence, but yet that measure of distance would be a way to highlight that. So there'd be one area methodologically, I think, where there could be some extensive innovation in measuring the relationships, because social distance really incorporates, you know, both the attitudes and the behaviors, and it gets at this question of perceptions of justice, etc. And then the other measure that I thought was kind of critical here, but they didn't necessarily see, and perhaps Neil and Jean or others in their research saw this in doing their research, which is what might be called dyadic relationships, you know, how particularly key dyadic relationships within certain societies become very important. So this is question of looking not just at particularly the more diverse the society, the more these relationships among or between key subsections of the population. And when I mean a dyad here, we often go to the sort of measure of ethnic or identity-based conflict, which are sort of done on the basis of dyads occasionally. But here, what I mean by dyads could also be, for example, relationships among key elites as an example of a dyadic relationship. And then finally, the measure that could be really interesting, and I saw resonated in a few of the articles, was the importance of symbolism and constructing these relationships. There's a lot of times what we see in the literature, particularly in the deep literature, would be that the understanding of social cohesion is very much based on perceptions or attitudes. And that's why the Varieties of Peace is a very useful approach. But where do we see analysis of those symbols that are divisive or unifying? And so outside of the work of, say, Stuart Kaufman, who's looked at symbolism and symbolic politics on the road to violence, here we need there has been some good work on things like memorialization and other things, but what I'd be interested in is an understanding of those symbols that illustrate or reflect the variety of peace. So is there some sort of analysis of these symbols that could relate to the typology of varieties. But those were some of the methodological considerations. But Marie-Joëlle is right. This points us in the direction of important qualitative research. So I actually had a question for Nilanjana, which was around the choice for focus groups. And how did focus groups provide you insights that went beyond, say, social surveys?
Nila, you can go ahead and respond to that question, and then I think we're probably out of time. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I missed the question, Elisabeth. Would you be able to?
Tim, would you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, happy to. I was very interested. I can imagine any number of young scholars designing their research designs at the moment, and these different or older scholars. In the case of myself, we're really very much on thinking about methodology for these things. And you had the choice for focus groups, and I'd be very interested in why you chose focus groups rather than, say, community-based surveys or social surveys, the methodological thinking behind that.
Thank you, Tim. I'm sorry, my dog just came in pushing the door, and so that distracted me for a few minutes. I think that could be what happened. Apologies about asking you to repeat the question. So my decision to do focus groups was actually, I wanted to get the communal narrative about peace. I wanted to see whether there's a distinct communal narrative that exists within these different communities in Sri Lanka. And I think surveys could have helped it as well. My thinking around going specifically for focus groups was because focus groups allowed shaping that communal narrative, and it would allow highlighting it would provide the space for people to build upon each other's ideas and provide provide shape to a distinct narrative. That was the thinking behind going for focus groups. And also the other reason is I have mostly been doing ethnographic research. So my training is in qualitative work as well. So I thought my training would support me in more in doing focus groups than doing a larger survey. But that's certainly something that could provide a lot of insight and would really be an interesting study to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that note about methodologies of studying peace, I can just say that the next series of workshops that we're arranging in June have the title Making Peace Researchable, and aims at exploring different tangible methodological tools and strategies for exploring peace. So hopefully there will some form of publication will come of that as well, even though, as you all know, it takes a while. I'd also realized that the comments that I referred to in the chat by Anna cannot be seen by all attendees. So I'm just going to say that for more information about what's going on in the Varieties of Peace network, please visit our webpage, and please also join the network if you do research along these lines or are interested in staying in touch. And please do apply to edit or to edit a JPD special issue. It's a great experience. And of course, read this special issue after this. Thank you so much to Nila for presenting your article, to the discussants for offering your insights and helping us to continue thinking beyond this special issue, and to all of the attendees for listening. And I hope we will be able to connect in other ways soon. Thank you all.